السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. بسم الله والحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله. الحمد لله حمدا يوافي نعمه ويكافئ مزيده، وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما يا كريم. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. رب زدني علما رب زدني علما رب زدني علما. اللهم لا سهل إلا ما جعلته سهلا وأنت تجعل الحزن إذا شئت سهلا. Welcome everyone to this talk on the home of a Muslima. And of course, what we mean by that is a home of a Muslim in general, right? But because of the fact that there are certain tasks that Allah Azza wa Jal has designated to certain people in society, then naturally the Muslima comes to mind when we talk about the home, because as the Prophet ﷺ said in a very famous hadith in both Bukhari and Muslim, he said that kullukum ra'in, every single one of you happens to be a shepherd, right? And the Prophet went on to speak about a number of different roles in society, and he spoke of the role of a leader, a political leader. He said فَالْأَمِيرُ رَاعٍ, that even the political leader, the Amir, happens to be a shepherd as well, and he's going to be taking care of the people in society. Then he says, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that a man is also a shepherd, and he will be a shepherd in terms of the family, okay? In terms of the entire structure of the family. When he spoke about the woman, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said she's also a shepherd in the house of her husband and her children, his children, okay? So her task, based on this hadith, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam described primarily as the chores, the acts, the noble duty of looking after the household, right? Now, of course, in our times, as people happen to be remodeling the roles of gender and so on and so forth, then this often comes into question. Is it, just the household that the woman has to take care of? Is it also things outside and so on and so forth? But in this particular hadith, the Prophet ﷺ quite clearly described the primary role. Now, in every single household, based on the personal circumstances of the people, it might be a little bit different, right? The husband may not be working as often, the woman might have to work, right? Depending on the private circumstances of that particular household. And many other things may be divided in a different way. But the primary responsibility in a normal circumstance, in a generic circumstance, is that the husband will be asked if he's not bringing the bread home, and the wife will be asked if things are going wrong at home. That's how the Prophet ﷺ defined it. Now, if anybody forfeits one of their responsibilities, gives it to another person, that's perfectly fine, but that means the other person has to take that responsibility as well. But the primary responsibility, as I said, this is how the Prophet ﷺ described. So for that reason, I decided that this particular talk might be best addressed to Muslimat. And of course, there's days in which the Prophet ﷺ used to specifically address only women. In fact, one of the days, some of the Sahabiyat, they came to the Prophet ﷺ and they said to the Prophet ﷺ that give us one day, at least one day a week. There's all these men all the time. They've got a different set of questions, and they've got a different set of issues, and so please just give us one day. And the Prophet ﷺ from then on made a weekly time that was fixed for women, right? Now, when we think of a house, immediately we think of making this house. We think of furnishing this house. We think of designing the home. We think of putting together all of the different the structure of the house as well, right? For many of us, we're not going to be building our own homes, literally. We're probably going to rent or buy or something like that, right? So we're more concerned about furnishing the house and designing this home. But many times we're also reminded in speeches and by preachers and in talks and so forth, sometimes rightfully so, that this is just the dunya, and so we're not supposed to design, and we're not supposed to take care, and we're not supposed to, right? And there's a whole list of them. But in reality, it's okay to do that. This particular quarter, the house, is the kingdom of a woman. So she is to design and she is to furnish and she is to take care of it, whichever way she pleases. There's nothing religiously wrong with this, and it's in fact encouraged. In fact, Allah Azza wa Jal said in the Quran, He said that هُوَ أَنْشَأَكُم مِّنَ الْأَرْضِ. Allah is the one who took you out from this earth, right? وَاسْتَعْمَرَكُمْ فِيهَا. And He did what He called isti'mar for you within the land. Now, many of the translators of this verse, they just said He settled you in the land, right? He placed you in the land, He settled you down, and so forth. But when I thought about the tafsir of this ayah, I realized the translations might not be doing justice to what Allah Azza wa Jalla is saying about over here. Because Allah is saying, وَاسْتَعْمَرَكُمْ فِيهَا, and He made you umar in it. He made you developers therein, right? So He made you two things. He made you beneficiaries and He made you developers. So He wants you to develop and He wants you to be benefiting from everything within this world. So whether that be planting around the house, whether that be gardening. In fact, this is actually encouraged in a hadith, so much so that the Prophet ﷺ, he said that إِذَا قَامَتِ الْقِيَامَةِ, when the day of judgment comes, right? And one of you happens to have like something like a sprout, a little plant in his hand, right? Or a palm cut. And it's in your hand. If it's possible for you to plant it, فَإِنْ اسْتَطَاعَ أَنْ يَغْرِسَهَا فَلْيَغْرِسْهَا. If it's possible for him to plant it, the Prophet ﷺ said, do it, because there's going to be a reward in that little plant that you end up planting. So, and of course, it's beloved to human nature as well, right? That's why Allah Azza wa Jal always talks about jannat, right? Gardens, because people love to have gardens, around their houses and in their homes and so on and so forth. So that's one of the etiquettes then when it comes to furnishing the home as well, right? And this is perhaps one of the most important ones, and that is that many a times, I know all of you have probably heard this hadith, and if you haven't heard it, you probably remember some aspect of it, right? That one of the branches of faith is if you see something on the floor, you pick it up and you move it aside. But it's always translated, and rightfully so, to move it out of the road, right? But it really is to move it out of the way. So that way is also your house. If you see something that is out of place, it's not sitting in the right place, then when you pick it up and you move it out of the way, then that is actually a branch of faith. That is actually one of the things that a person will be rewarded for. And it's the reward of this, subhanAllah, even though the Prophet ﷺ said, this is the lowest of the branches of faith. When he said there's 70 branches of faith, the highest one is La ilaha illallah. The lowest one happens to be moving something out of the way. Even though it's the lowest, it's so high. How high? He mentioned to us in another hadith, and this hadith is in Bukhari and Muslim as well. He said that as a man was walking, بَيْنَمَا رَجُلٌ يَمْشِي, a man was just walking by somewhere, he found a thorn on the ground, and he pushed that thorn away, right? He took that thorn and moved it out of the way. Allah Azza wa Jal was so thankful to this man. Allah Azza wa Jal was so happy with this man that the Prophet ﷺ said, Allah forgave the man simply for moving something out of the way. And this should be really encouraging of, placing everything in your house in the right place, especially if it comes in the way, meaning you're walking up the stairs, there happens to be something in the stairs, just pick it up and move it aside. The Prophet ﷺ said, when he did it for Allah Azza wa Jal, and Allah Azza wa Jal forgave his sins. Now, beautifying is just generally within that hadith in which the Prophet ﷺ said that Inna Allah Jamilun yuhibbul jamal. Allah Azza wa Jal is beautiful and He loves beauty as well, right? One of the things that also happens, and this is sad, it happens in our houses, many of us, right? And may not also happen as well. It happens sometimes on streets, it happens in public places, public washrooms, public everywhere, even on roads. The Prophet ﷺ said, "Man salla sakhimatahu," whoever releases his waste, okay? And the way he put it is whoever releases something that people really dislike. Now, this could include a lot of things. It could include basically all sorts of waste that come out of the body, right? Every single thing. So whoever releases that in a place which people have to walk, or in a place where people have to frequent, right? And he doesn't clean it up and move it out of people's way, the Prophet ﷺ said, فَعَلَيْهِ لَعْنَةُ اللَّهِ. That person will have the la'na of Allah Azza wa Jalla. That person will have the la'na of Allah, the malaika, وَالنَّاسِ أَجْمَعِينَ, and all of the people as well. Because sometimes people actually, if you on the street, you see something that someone just released wastes, and sometimes it doesn't have to be bodily waste as well. Sometimes it's wastes that industries end up chucking away in rivers and lakes and so on and so forth. So what happens? People are always cursing the person who left their waste over here, and that leads to him receiving the curse of mankind altogether, as the Prophet ﷺ said, right? So if you clean up, this will be in the good books, as Allah Azza wa Jall's messenger told us, that all of the deeds, the Prophet told us, all of the deeds of mankind were brought before me, right? The good ones, the bad ones, everything was brought before me. And I noticed in the list of good deeds, the Prophet ﷺ said was simply cleaning something that happened to be on the floor. إِمَاطَةُ الْأَذَىٰ عَنِ الطَّرِيقِ. And in the list of bad things was snot that happened to be in the masjid which wasn't buried. What does that mean? Really, historically, I mean, when you think of a masjid now, you think immediately of a carpet, right? But of old, in the past, what they had was a masjid that had soil, or that was on dirt, on land, right? Now, sometimes people would have to spit, sometimes people would have to clean their noses and so forth. So you wouldn't have a Kleenex, so people would do it right on the floor. Now, when you do it right on the floor, then what happens? It's there for people to step in, right? And it messes everything up for everyone, and it's gross and so forth. So in that circumstance, the Prophet ﷺ is describing that he didn't bury the snot. Now in our case, you clean yourself up properly and you put your things away to ensure that nobody else gets affected by the tissues or so on and so forth. It's nice and clean, right? Now we're talking a lot about cleaning, but I'm going to get to other things as well, inshaAllah ta'ala. Yeah. And Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam really used to love cleanliness so much, so that one day, I mean, this almost sounds like something you wouldn't do at someone else's house. But Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam was at someone else's house. Of course, he is a messenger, he's teaching people as well, so there's a different circumstance that the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam is in. But he went to someone's house, and they had a mat. Unfortunately, this mat had not been washed and cleaned for perhaps decades, who knows how long, right? But for a long time, the mat hadn't been cleaned, it became really black, as the hadith says, right? So because it became really, really black, the Prophet ﷺ, he wanted to pray salah, but he told them, you see that corner over there? You get a mop or something else, whatever they had to clean up at that time, clean up that area so that I may pray over there. So the Prophet ﷺ was so keen on cleaning that even when he went to someone else's house, he noticed that the house wasn't as clean as he wanted it. He told them to move something out of the way so they may clean up over there. So Rasulullah ﷺ then took that as an opportunity to pray over there and also teach them a lesson, right? Now this is for all of the mothers, right? And also the fathers that do this as well. Oftentimes we all have children and there's diapers, right? And the diapers are very dirty, since we're talking about cleanliness. And the diapers can leak as well. And all of that can happen, and it's not something that anybody wants to happen, but it happens. Now, it seems like a very trivial matter, but the Prophet ﷺ told us that this is not a trivial matter, okay? In terms of children, because they are susceptible to becoming, to having ritual impurities, or to having impurities rather, physical impurities, So it's important that we are very keen on keeping them clean. There's actually specific rulings in Islam for children just because of diapers, okay? Just to ensure that they don't get affected by the harms of impurities on their body. And that's why when it's nighttime, what do? We bring our children in, right? When it's Maghrib time. And I'll talk a little bit about that as well. Why do we do that? Well, we do that, as according to some of the scholars, we do that because of the impurities that they have. Why? I'll explain. But let's stay with the diapers for a second, right? Now, of course, alhamdulillah, in our day and age and for centuries, we don't have the same circumstances as they did in the time of the Prophet ﷺ, where if somebody wished to urinate, they wouldn't have a built washroom. They'll have to do it in a pot, or they'll have to do it in a container, or so on and so forth. And these containers would not be emptied out immediately in some households. So the Prophet ﷺ said that nobody ends up leaving urine in a corner, in like a container, in a corner in their house. And if someone does that, then he said, the angels don't end up entering this house. فَإِنَّ الْمَلَائِكَةَ لَا تَدْخُلُ بَيْتًا فِيهِ بَوْلٌ. Angels don't end up entering this house that happens to have urine in it, right? And then the Prophet ﷺ said, where you take showers, then don't urinate over there. But the point here is that we might collect all these impurities and we have them boxed in one place, but they are still within the house. So it's best for you and I and everyone to make sure the impurities are expelled of our houses as soon as possible. Whenever we can, immediately, all of the impurities, put them in a bag, throw them out of the house. Why? Because the Prophet ﷺ said that angels don't come into a house that happens to have urine in a certain place, right? So of course we want the angelic presence within our house. And we want to have satanic presence as far away from our house, right? But people sometimes complain about the fact that they feel some evil presence in their homes. Well, here's one of the reasons why. You can avoid that evil presence in your home, and you can invoke the angelic presence in your home, and that is to keep your home pure from all of the filth. Why do we, when we're going to the bathroom specifically of every room in our house, why do we seek refuge in Allah Azza wa Jal from shaitan at that time specifically, right? We seek refuge in Allah min al-khubuthi wal-khaba'ith, from the filthy male jinns and from the filthy evil female jinns as well, right? So the reason why we're doing that is because shayateen, they end up gathering in places where there happens to be filth. And another thing, and inshallah nobody really does this here, and I'm sure most people don't do it, but it is something that people think about, is getting dogs. It's not permissible to have a dog in your house, okay? Some people, they find it very difficult to cope with this. They find it very difficult to think, deal with this, because dog is the man's best friend, as some people like to believe, right? So the Prophet ﷺ said that man amsaka kalban, whoever gets a dog, فإنه ينقص كل يوم من عمله قيراط. Then from such a person, every single day, 1 qirat of ajr will go down. 1 qirat of ajr will go down. What does qirat mean? It means, it literally means 24th. Okay, according to some of the meanings, it means a 20th. According to others, it means 24th. So if you think about that, then you realize the word qirat in English actually comes from the word qirat in Arabic, right? But it's metaphorically used for something that is really valuable, okay? So meaning a lot of ajr will be taken away from this person's, simply why? Because he happens to have a dog. And another tradition, the Prophet said, qiratan, 2 qirats, okay? A lot of ajr, even more so than the previous one, except if it happens to be a dog that he's using to protect his crops, or a dog that he's using to protect the livestock that he happens to have. So there's a couple of reasons why the Prophet ﷺ permitted a person to have a dog. Other than that, no. Now, there are people that say, well, no, it's okay because there happens to be an opinion, right? There happens to be an opinion. Now, it's true that sometimes there happens to be legitimate disagreements within Muslims and so forth, but not every single time there is another opinion that means that it's okay, right? We have to see how valid it is, how substantiated it is, and so on and so forth. Here, the Prophet ﷺ clearly mentioned that whoever gets a dog every single day, as they have this dog, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will decrease from their ajr. And another hadith, remember we're talking about the angelic presence? The Prophet ﷺ said, لا تدخل الملائكة بيتا فيه كلب ولا صورة. That the angels don't end up entering a house that happens to have a dog or it happens to have a picture. Now, what does picture exactly mean? I'll talk a little bit about that. Of course, immediately when you think of pictures, you think of the type of pictures that we take nowadays, right? Even this camera is some sort of a picture, right? So now essentially when photography started, in Arabic, people didn't call these photographs, pictures, surah. Okay, they wouldn't call it surah. They would actually call it ukus, which means a reflection. Okay? So later on, as the language developed, people started to borrow the word surah for these ukus. They started to use the word surah for reflections, right? And that's when perhaps a lot of the confusion occurred, whether we're allowed to take pictures or we're not allowed to take pictures, right? But what's meant by this surah in this particular hadith is definitely not a reflection of a human being, such as the camera that you have in your phone or a video camera or so on and so forth. What's really meant by this is when you have something that is, firstly, something that happens to be a statue, a carved object, all right? Secondly, even if it happens to be 2D, but it's something that was drawn in that way, okay? And another important thing is it's drawn and it's meant to look like something that is created. And that obviously gets rid of caricature, okay? Because cartoons are a little bit different. Cartoons, they're not actually meant to look like human beings. They're actually meant to mock, or they're meant to exaggerate certain features within a human being or within an animal or so on and so forth. So it's a little bit different. And that's why many of the scholars say cartoons is not an issue, or even if it happens to be drawings, but it's drawn in a way where a person is not trying to make it seem like the actual creation. They are actually purposely, or perhaps purposefully, to make it more attractive for children, exaggerating certain features of the cartoon. So in that case, it doesn't fall within this particular tradition, right? But nonetheless, what does fall is if you happen to have something that is a sculpture, right? Now that would be definitely a surah. So you want to take that out of your house, because the Prophet ﷺ said that لا تدخل الملائكة بيتا فيه كلب ولا صورة. Another thing that would fall is if an artist was to try their level best to make it seem like, and they're not trying to be cartoony, right? They're trying to make it seem like this is actually this is actually like the creation of Allah Azza wa Jalla. Then they are attempting to match par with the creation of Allah. As it's described in some of the hadith, that was the problem with this. Another thing that could fall within is robots. Now they're making robots that they're trying to make even the skin texture as close as human beings as possible, right? I know this might be an idea that people will find it hard to swallow, but think about it. You're trying to make it speak like a human being, think like a human being. You're trying to make it all of those things. And then in addition to that, you're giving it all the features of the creation of Allah Azza wa Jalla as well. It might fall within this hadith, wallahu a'lam. But definitely the toys of children, they don't fall within this hadith, right? Aisha radiallahu ta'ala anha had her own toys as well. When she was, even after she had gotten married to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, one day the Prophet returned from a journey, and this was towards the end of the life of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So she was even much older at that time. And she had something similar to a closet in the house. It wasn't really a closet because the Prophet's house was very small, but it was something similar to a closet. And then the wind blew, and inside of there happened to be her dolls, radiallahu ta'ala anha. And in there happened to be a horse that had 2 wings, okay? There's a horse that had 2 wings. So the Prophet ﷺ, it caught his eyes, and he said, "What's that?" So Aisha said that that's a horse. But he's like, that horse has two wings. So she said, don't you know that Sulaiman alayhi salam used to have a horse with two wings? She's telling Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam. So the Prophet ﷺ started laughing when she said that. Radiyallahu ta'ala anha. Right? So that children's toys are not included within this, right? And another thing to note is to clean up the dishes, right? And there's a reason for that, because when there's something left behind in dishes, then what happens, there could be all sorts of insects and all sorts of things trying to feed off that overnight. And then if it's not washed well, then a person might get sick from that, right? So cleaning up the dishes is something that's really important. And also cleaning up your own body as well after you eat food, like washing the hands, making sure the mouth is, you brush your teeth well and your mouth is cleaned well. Why? Because all of this can actually lead to a person being bit by something or something unpleasant happening to the individual. And the Prophet ﷺ actually told us this when he said that whoever goes to sleep and he happens to have some oil or some moisture almost in his hand, right? And he doesn't wash it, if something happens to his hand, then he shouldn't blame anyone but himself, right? Because you're almost inviting things to come and feed off of you, right? So the Prophet ﷺ told us to wash the hands and wash ourselves well before we go to sleep so that we're not harmed during the night. Now, as I said earlier, I'll come back to children going out at night. That happens actually a lot. A lot of parents are unaware of this, and it is important to ensure that your children are in by Maghrib time. They're in, doors locked, and everything is closed. Before that time, much before, so that even when the Maghrib time actually comes, children are already home. Because the Prophet mentioned in a hadith that when it is the beginning of the night, i.e. Maghrib time, right? And at that time, the Prophet said, فَكُفُّوا صِبْيَانَكُمْ. So bring your children back and hang on to them, hold on to them. Why? Because shayateen at that time, they start to come out. Okay? But he didn't say bring the elderly back. He said bring the children back, right? And then he said when a little bit of time passes, right? A little bit of time passes, then you can let your children go again, but make sure you close the doors. And this is what the hadith said. Then close the doors and remember Allah Azza wa Jal. Why? Because then shayateen cannot come into a house that has been closed. Okay? There's also other ways to keep shayateen out of your house. I'll tell you that in a minute. But the point that I'm trying to get to over here is that at Maghrib time, you bring everyone in, the children specifically. Now, the scholars, they commented on this. They said the reason for this is because, and of course it's talking about really small children, and the reason for this is because there's a possibility that they haven't washed themselves well. And if there's a possibility that they might have najasat, impurities, right? So if they have impurities, what did we say earlier on? What do shayateen feel attracted by? Impurities. So because of that, you A, be very keen on making sure all the children are washing themselves properly. B, ensure that diapers are changed on time. C, ensure that when it's Maghrib time, the doors are closed and everybody is in the house, right? And there's another way to ensure shayateen don't end up coming into the house as well. And this is also found in a hadith. The Prophet ﷺ said, when one of you enters the house, then remember to mention Allah Azza wa Jalla. Bismillahi walajna, Bismillahi kharajna, wa ala rabbina tawakkalna. Right? The dua of entering the home. And when one of you begins to eat food, then say Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Why? Because when you do that, then shaitan says, La mabita lakum wa la asha. You don't have a place to stay here tonight, and you don't have dinner as well that you're going to get over here. Okay? So when you remember Allah Azza wa Jalla constantly, then the satanic presence in your home, it disappears, right? And when you remember Allah Azza wa Jal constantly also, the angelic presence within the home also begins to increase. Another thing to do is to close all the pots, right? In the past, they used to have something called a qirba. What's a qirba? It's basically a little bottle that is made of skin, leather. They would cut it out of animals, and then they would put whatever drink they wanted to put in there. Sometimes they would put water, other times whatever else. And one of the things that made this really useful was because it would be a way of refrigerating as well, because they could put some water on top of it and then put it on in a window that would be open. So when the wind blows, the bottle, the skin would also start to become cold, right? So now the drink inside would also become cold as well, right? So the Prophet ﷺ said, when you have these qirab, tie them up at nighttime and at all times, actually. Tie them up, meaning every bottle that you have, every container that you have, make sure it's closed on time so nothing ends up going in it, and then whatever you have, it goes to waste, or people get affected in their health because they end up eating an ant or something like that, right? Make sure it is closed and sealed well. And then the Prophet ﷺ said that, and if you have containers, then cover them up, right? Cover up all of the containers. And if you have lanterns or something like this, and you've lit them, then make sure you have unlit them or you've turned them off. Why? Because at times, at nighttime, it may fall and then cause a fire, right? A needless fire. And that happened even at the time of the Prophet ﷺ. One day the Prophet was sitting, and a little rat came, and it had taken the thread out of the lantern, the thread that's used to light the fire. And it was still lit, and he brought it to the Prophet ﷺ and put it on top of the prayer mat of Rasulullah ﷺ. So the prayer mat started to burn. So at that time, the Prophet ﷺ said, when you go to sleep, then make sure you turn the lights off. And specifically what he means by that is the fire, right? Make sure you turn the fire off. And why? He said, because shaitan ends up telling something like this to pick up something like that and do something like this. Shaitan ends up telling something like a rat to pick up a thread or anything else that's burning, a candle perhaps, right? To pick that up and walk over to somewhere else that would then burn the house down, and la qaddar Allah. So I guess in our times, one of the things that can be similar to that is your stove. Make sure it's turned off so that there's no fires that are caused. There's no damage to anyone's life or anything that occurs because of that, right? Another way to bring angelic presence in the home is to remember Allah Azza wa Jal at every single moment, because there's du'as throughout the day. There's du'as when you wake up, adhkar al-sabah. There's du'as at nighttime, adhkar al-masa. There's du'a when you go to sleep. There's adhkar, right? Supplications, prayers that you can pray when you're about to go to sleep. Those that you pray when you are, dhikr that you do when you wake up as well. So doing all of those adhkar brings your house to life, literally, as the Prophet ﷺ said. He said that a house in which Allah is remembered and another house in which Allah is not remembered, the example of them is like the example of the one who is dead and the one who's alive, right? So the one in which nobody remembers Allah Azza wa Jal, all the adhkar are not being done, that is the dead household, as the Prophet ﷺ said. And the one in which people are remembering Allah, that is the lively household. That is where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will allow the angelic presence to be there, right? And one of the greatest adhkar is the Quran. Okay, so you start your day off with reading a little bit of the Quran, at least. And when you do that, a small house will start to feel bigger, right? This is something that the Prophet actually mentioned. The barakah comes to a degree that it actually affects the house literally, and you start to feel that, oh well, this place is not as small as we thought after all, right? It starts to feel a lot bigger. And he said that إِنَّ الْبَيْتَ لَا يَتَّسِعُ عَلَىٰ أَهْلِهِ وَتَحْضُرُهُ الْمَلَائِكَةِ, that indeed the house ends up becoming enough for the family and even more people as the angels also show up, and shayateen end up leaving, and the good of this household becomes manifest. وَيَكْثُرُ خَيْرُهُ, it becomes a lot. The goodness in this house becomes very real, and it becomes a lot. All of that if they end up reading the Quran. يقرأ فيه القرآن, the house in which the Quran happens to be read. And then the Prophet mentioned the opposite as well, that the house starts to become constrained for the family members, and the shayateen the angels end up leaving, and the shayateen end up coming, simply because people are not reading the Quran in this house. So reading the Quran brings barakat within your household in a way where you can't imagine. All these things that the Prophet is mentioning, your house starts to feel more comfortable. You have angelic presence in the house. Shayateen end up leaving, and the goodness of the house just increases. So all the good that you were looking for, all of that, how? From the barakah of reading and continuously making sure that the Quran is read, right? And that's why it's really important for that habit to be developed in children from the very, very beginning, right? One of the things that a sociologist by the name of Ibn Khaldun is one of the foremost sociologists in the history of Islam, and also otherwise as well. He was probably the first person who had founded this science of sociology, right? And he talks about all these different countries and regions of the Muslim lands, and he's describing their educational system, right? And as he's doing that, and I think his book is actually available in English as well, if somebody wants to read it. But he's describing the educational system all across the Muslim lands, and he explains that it's like the culture of Muslims to ensure that the very, very first thing that their children learn is the Quran. He went to Africa, in his book at least. He went to Andalus, Spain. He goes to Hijaz. He goes to Habasha. He goes everywhere in this book describing the educational systems, and he says the first thing in all of these places, what are they doing? They're learning the Quran, right? And because upon us other foreign educational systems are enforced, we end up teaching them all other things except the Quran. And then we sometimes ask ourselves, how come the personality is not developing the way I wanted it to develop, the way I always envisioned my child to grow up? Well, one of the key factors in a Muslim child's education is that the Quran becomes the cornerstone of the education. So everything else after that is seen with the lens of the Quran, right? The child already has that within his mind, so everything else the child ends up seeing through the lenses of the Quran, right? And of course, from the Quran, you can read anything, but specifically when you read Surah Al-Baqarah, the Prophet ﷺ said that shaitan ends up running away from a house in which Surah Al-Baqarah is read. So make a frequent habit of ensuring that you're reading Surah Al-Baqarah in the house as well, right? Another way to furnish the house, another way to design the house, is to make a masjid in the house, okay? This is something that some of the Sahaba, Ammar ibn Yasir specifically, was the first one to start this sunnah, okay? He made a small masjid for himself in the house. And then many of the Sahaba, they caught on that Ammar has a masjid in his house, so they started to also make masajid, so much so that some of the Sahaba would ask the Prophet ﷺ to come over to their house and pray for them in some corner of the house so that they can have this place, this area, to be their masjid, right? Utban ibn Malik from the Ansar, he asked the Prophet ﷺ to come over because he used to be an imam. He wasn't in an area where he could reach the salah of the Prophet ﷺ, so he used to be an imam for the people in his locality, but sometimes he couldn't reach because there was floods that would happen. So he asked the Prophet, and his eyes were getting weak, so he couldn't walk around it. So he asked the Prophet ﷺ that come to my house and pray for me. Pray in a certain area in my house. So then when the Prophet came over, Abu Bakr came over, he asked Uthman, where would you like me to pray, right? And he's very smart as well in this. Why? Because if he started his own masjid in the house, then people would have been like, you're starting a new masjid, right? We already have one. But he realized if he brings the Prophet and tells them, no, the Prophet prayed here, then everybody will be like, okay, no problem. The Prophet prayed here, then it's good enough to be a masjid. So he asked the Prophet ﷺ to pray there, and then he made a small masjid in that. in that area, right? So make a small masjid in your household because it has many benefits. Okay, it has many benefits. One of those benefits is that you can ensure to keep that specific area clean. Okay, especially when you have young children, you know that it's hard to keep the house clean, even if you try, right? And especially when it comes to najasat, right? You have to be very careful of najasat, of impurities. Why? Because again, satanic presence, and again, the idea of your prayer not being accepted because you are praying on something that happens to be impure. So if you designate a certain area in your house that this, I will always make sure happens to be crystal, really clean. And the Prophet ﷺ had this habit as well, and he would tell his wives to do it as well. Make that area in the house into a masjid, make sure that is, and then وَكَانَ يَأْمُرُ أَن تُطَيَّبَ وَتُنَظَّفَ. He would tell us to clean it up and also to put good scent in it, perfume or something that would make it smell well, right? So it is a comfortable area to pray at all times. Number two, it will be easier to pray when people are asleep. So you have your little personal corner that you can always go to. Nobody else will be there except if they're coming for the purpose of prayer. And number three, and this might be very important, okay, is that if you want to make i'tikaf, then the masajid of the houses, according to the Hanafiya, you can make i'tikaf in, okay? According to some of the other scholars, you can't. And I have a lecture online on i'tikaf, and I mentioned this in there as well in more detail. But personally, I say that it may be difficult for a woman to go and make i'tikaf in the masjid because of several reasons, right? So if you have a masjid in the house that you've made, and there are scholars such as the Hanafiya and some of the Shafi'iyya and some of the Malikiyya as well, that say that it's okay for you to make i'tikaf in the masjid of the house, not anywhere else in the house, then it's a good solution, because you can ensure that you can look after your children, you can ensure that you can do everything else that you normally do, and still be able to get closer to Allah Azza wa Jal through this masjid, which the Prophet ﷺ encouraged and instituted. Now, of course, it doesn't mean that this area becomes an endowment, not like a masjid that becomes an endowment. It's not like that. When you move, it also moves along with you. But that is something that the Prophet ﷺ had taught us to do in the homes as well, to make an area in which we pray, and in which we worship Allah Azza wa Jal, and in which we ensure that that everything happens to be clean over here. These are some of the adab, some of the manners, some of the etiquette that I thought to share with you, and I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant you good households, and I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give you the tawfiq to practice and to convey. It is, of course, from the start of any wedding, one of the dreams of a woman to ensure that they have a house that happens to be a beautiful house, that happens to be kept well, that happens to be kempt well. So one of the ways to do that is to increase the angelic presence within this house. And we noticed through what we learned today that through the adhkar, through ensuring that things happen to be clean, specifically when it comes to najasat, even more so, and through ensuring that things are organized, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can give us all that, and through also ensuring that we are following the guidelines of Allah, such as not entering the dogs into our houses, such as making sure that that people are given their private space. By the way, that, before I finish off, is probably a good thing to mention as well. People should be given privacy in their private quarters as well, okay? This is something that I can't detail right now, but a lot of the ahkam of this are in Surah An-Nur, and I've taught it before. And Surah An-Nur is something that you should aspire to learn, inshallah, in the future as well, if you haven't, because it has a lot of guidance for the household as well. And specifically the Sahaba, they used to encourage the women to learn Surah An-Nur and the rulings in there. But we'll stop with this, inshallah. Jazakumullahu khairan. Wa sallallahu ala sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'een.